They put their hands on his wife. The police did nothing, so he made sure they'd never touch her or anyone else again. Michael never thought much about the town when they moved there. It was quiet, the kind of place where people waved at each other from across the street but didn't ask too many questions. He and his wife, Adrian, had built a life there. Nothing fancy, but solid. A home with a small garden, weekend trips to the farmer's market, dinners at the same cozy diner they'd been going to for years. At first, the looks didn't bother them. Michael had grown up in a place where race never really seemed to matter, and Adrian had always had a way of brushing things off. "People are gonna stare," she'd say, laughing it away. Let them waste their energy. But it wasn't just staring. It was the way conversations would stop when they entered a room, how the cashier at the grocery store always seemed to take an extra second before handing Adrian her change, the barely concealed whispers. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was there. Then came the first real sign. It was a Saturday morning, and Adrian had driven into town to grab coffee. She returned home, keys shaking in her hand, face pale. Someone had written something on the back window of her car, a single word scrawled in thick black marker, "Leave." Michael had tried to stay calm. Some idiot with nothing better to do, he told her. He grabbed a bottle of glass cleaner and wiped it away in seconds, but something in her expression told him that for her, it wouldn't come off so easily. Then it started happening more often. The slashed tire outside the diner, the dent in Adrian's car door after she left it in the lot for an hour, the way the old man at the post office, who had always been friendly, suddenly acted like she wasn't there. Michael didn't want to admit it, but he could see it in her eyes. Adrian wasn't feeling safe anymore. One night, they were sitting at the kitchen table when she finally asked, "Do you think we made a mistake coming here?" Michael sighed. "No, this is our home. We don't let people push us out." She nodded, but he could tell she didn't believe it, not completely. And if he was honest, neither did he. Things got worse. It wasn't just the notes or the stares anymore. A group of men, always the same ones, started showing up wherever Adrian went. They didn't say much at first, just hung around watching. At the gas station, outside the grocery store, even in the parking lot of her job. Then one afternoon, one of them got too close. Adrian had been walking to her car, balancing a bag of groceries in one hand and her purse in the other, when she felt someone behind her. She turned to see one of the men, mid-20s, a smirk on his face. "You dropped something," he said, holding up a single grape. Adrian took a step back. "I didn't drop that." The man chuckled. "Yeah, you did. But hey, we all make mistakes." She didn't respond, just unlocked her car and got in. But as she pulled out of the lot, she saw him still standing there watching her leave. When she told Michael about it, he clenched his fists under the table. "Next time, call me," he said. She nodded, but there was no next time, because after that, things got even worse. But Michael had no idea how far they were willing to go. Michael knew something had shifted. Adrian wasn't herself anymore. She had always been the type to walk with her head high, to laugh a little too loudly in restaurants, to make strangers feel like friends in a matter of minutes. But lately, her laughter had quieted. She double-checked the locks before bed. She hesitated before stepping outside alone. He hated it. One evening, Michael was fixing something under the hood of his truck when he heard a noise from the street, a low chuckle, followed by the sound of an engine revving. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped toward the driveway, just in time to see a car creeping past their house. 4 men inside, young, cocky, the same ones who had been watching Adrian. One of them flicked a cigarette onto their lawn. Another leaned out the window. "Nice place," he called out, his voice dripping with something that made Michael's skin crawl. "Bet you worked real hard for it." The car didn't speed off. It rolled away slow enough to make a point. Michael stood there, jaw clenched, watching the taillights disappear. That night, he sat with Adrian in the living room, both of them pretending to watch the news. "They came by today," he finally said. She didn't look away from the screen. "I know." He sighed. "Maybe it's time to say something. Go to the police." Adrian let out a breath. "And tell them what? That a bunch of men are looking at me the wrong way?" "They're doing more than looking." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Yeah, but we both know nothing's going to happen unless they put their hands on me." Michael hated that she was right, but it didn't take long for them to cross that line. It happened on a Thursday. Michael was at work when his phone rang, Adrian's number. He answered, expecting her usual afternoon check-in, but the second he heard her voice, he knew something was wrong. "You need to come home," she whispered. "What happened?" "Please, Michael." Her voice broke. Just come home." He was already grabbing his keys. When he got there, she was sitting on the couch, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the floor. Her shirt was torn at the shoulder. A bruise was already forming near her collarbone. Michael's heart dropped. He knelt in front of her, hands shaking. "Tell me." Adrian swallowed hard. "I was coming out of the grocery store. They were waiting by my car." Michael didn't have to ask who they were. "They cornered me," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Blocked the driver's side door so I couldn't get in. One of them grabbed my arm, told me I should be more polite when people are just trying to be friendly." Michael felt his pulse in his ears. "Did they?" "No," she shook her head quickly. "They scared me, but they let me go." He exhaled slowly, trying to keep the fury from consuming him whole. "We're going to the police," he said. Adrian didn't argue. They sat in the station for over an hour before someone finally took their statement. A tired-looking officer named Deputy Fields listened, nodding at the right times, jotting down notes without much interest. When Adrian described the men, what they had been doing for weeks, how they had grabbed her, he barely reacted. "We'll look into it," he said. Michael stared at him. "That's it?" The deputy shrugged. "Look, I get that you're upset, but we don't have much to go on here. Did they take anything? Did they physically assault you?" "She has a bruise," Michael snapped. Fields sighed. "If you can identify the guy who left it, we might be able to do something. Otherwise, all we have is a claim that a couple of guys stood too close to your wife and said something she didn't like." Adrian flinched. Michael gritted his teeth. "So what? You're just going to wait until they do something worse?" Fields leaned back in his chair. "Sir, I suggest you go home. We'll file the report, but my advice? Maybe don't make waves." Michael didn't hear anything else. His blood was pounding too hard. He walked out of the station, feeling like he had been punched in the gut. Adrian followed, silent, holding her arms around herself like she was trying to make herself smaller. When they got home, she went straight to bed. Michael sat in the kitchen, staring at the wall. His whole life he had believed in handling things the right way, trusting the system, following the rules. But that night, something changed in him, because if the law wasn't going to protect them, he would. Michael barely slept that night. He sat in the dark, staring at the wall, his mind replaying Adrian's words over and over. "They cornered me. They grabbed my arm. They let me go. They let her go, this time." By morning his hands ached from how hard he had been clenching his fists. Adrian didn't say much when she woke up. She moved slowly, as if every motion drained what little energy she had left. Michael wanted to say something, to promise her things would be okay, but what would be the point? He had already seen how the world worked. He stayed home that day, making some excuse to his boss. Adrian insisted she was fine, but when she went to take a nap in the afternoon, he noticed the way she locked the bedroom door behind her. That was when he realized something. They had already won. Adrian was scared in her own home. She was checking over her shoulder, locking doors in the middle of the day, flinching when she heard car engines outside. These men hadn't just harassed her. They had stolen something from her. Michael had never hated anything more in his life. It happened later that evening. Michael had stepped out to grab the mail when he noticed the tire tracks across the front lawn, fresh. He scanned the street, his body going stiff. A car was parked a few houses down, the same car, the same group of men. They weren't watching him. They were watching the house. Michael's heartbeat hammered in his ears. He forced himself to take a deep breath to keep his voice steady. "What do you want?" The driver, one of the cocky ones, tall, blonde, with a smirk that made Michael's blood boil, rolled down his window. "Relax, man. Just enjoying the neighborhood." The others laughed. Michael didn't move. "You've made your point. Leave my wife alone." The blonde one tilted his head as if considering it. "Thing is, your wife's real nice to look at, real polite, too." Michael took a step forward. "I'm not asking." The driver held up his hands in mock surrender. "Oh, look at you, all tough now." He nodded toward the house. "Your lady didn't seem too tough yesterday, though. Looked kinda helpless." Michael didn't remember moving. 1 second he was standing still, the next he had crossed the yard, fists clenched, ready to drag the little bastard out of his seat. A gun clicked. Michael froze. One of the other men had pulled a pistol, resting it lazily against the car door. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, voice calm. The laughter stopped, the mood shifted. Michael felt his heart slamming against his ribs. He forced himself to take a step back, swallowing the rage that burned in his chest. The blonde one grinned. Grinned, satisfied. Good boy. Then, just as casually as they had arrived, the car rolled away. Michael stood there, his fists shaking, watching the taillights disappear. That was it. That was the moment. Michael had spent his whole life being the reasonable man, the man who talked things out, who let the authorities handle it, who didn't make waves. But reasonable men's wives didn't get stalked by psychopaths. Reasonable men didn't watch the people they loved live in fear. He turned, staring at the house, at the windows where Adrian had pulled the curtains closed, the door she had locked 3 times that morning, the life they had built here. He had trusted the system. He had done everything right, and none of it mattered. Michael walked inside, grabbed a beer from the fridge and sat at the kitchen table. He stared at the condensation rolling down the bottle, mind blank, body buzzing with something dark and sharp and final. By the time he finished that beer, he had made his decision. They weren't going to get away with this. Not anymore. Michael had never been the type to pick fights, but when a man's home is attacked, when his wife is afraid to step outside, when the law turns its back on him, he stops caring about playing fair. This wasn't about justice anymore. This was about making sure they never came near Adrian again, and fear wasn't going to be enough. Michael pressed the knife a fraction closer. It's personal now. Ricky's breath came shallow, his hands half raised as if unsure whether to defend himself or beg. "I didn't do anything. It was just talk, man. Just screwing around." Michael's grip tightened. "You followed her. You threatened her. You laughed while she was scared. And now you're going to tell me everything. Who planned it? Why? And where I can find the rest of you." Ricky's eyes darted to the exit, but Michael leaned in, cutting off his escape. "Don't be stupid," he warned. Ricky licked his lips, sweat beading at his temple. Okay, it was Wes. He gets off on this crap. I was just along for the ride, all right? I didn't mean..." Michael cut him off with a sharp press of the blade. "Where is he?" Ricky hesitated. Michael could see it, the calculation, the fear, the hope that maybe he could weasel out of this. He decided to remove that hope. With a swift movement, he dragged the edge of the knife just enough to nick the skin under Ricky's chin, a thin line of red appearing. Ricky sucked in a breath. "All right, he hangs out at that old warehouse off Route 9, near the train tracks. But man, you don't want to mess with him, he's..." Michael let go abruptly, stepping back. Ricky sagged against the wall, hands clutching his throat as if expecting worse. Michael gave him one last cold stare. If you or any of your friends so much as look at my wife again, I'll make sure this ends differently." Ricky nodded frantically, too afraid to speak. Michael turned and walked away, his mind already on the next name. Michael pressed the blade closer. Ricky shut up. "You're going to tell me where the rest of them are." Ricky's eyes darted, looking for an escape, but there wasn't one. You don't want to do this," he stammered. Michael leaned in. "I didn't, but you made sure I had to." A pause, then Ricky broke. "They're at Austin's place," he rushed out, "by the old mill down Route 9. Just let me go, man." Michael stared at him for a long second, then he pulled back. "Run," he said. Ricky didn't need to be told twice. Austin's house was exactly where Ricky said it was, a rundown place sitting on acres of empty land, no neighbors, no one to hear anything. Michael parked down the road and made his way in on foot, keeping low. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. This had to end tonight. Through the window, he saw them, Austin and two others, sitting around drinking, laughing like they had no care in the world, like they hadn't spent the past few weeks terrorizing his wife. Michael gripped the wrench in his hand. He wasn't going to kill them, but he was going to make sure they never forgot his name, and after tonight, they'd never forget Adrian's either. Michael had never been the type to pick fights, but when a man's home is attacked, when his wife is afraid to step outside, when the law turns its back on him, he stops caring about playing fair. This wasn't about justice anymore. This was about making sure they never came near Adrian again, and fear wasn't going to be enough. Michael spent the next day watching, studying. He had always been observant, the kind of man who noticed things others ignored, where people parked their cars, which bars they went to, who always looked over their shoulder. He knew exactly where to find them. The first one was a coward. Ricky, or Rick as he insisted people call him, wasn't the leader. He was just a follower, laughing along, throwing around his weight when he thought it was safe. Michael found him at a dive bar on the edge of town. Ricky was already 2 beers deep when Michael walked in, taking a seat at the far end of the counter. He didn't rush it, didn't even look at him at first. He just waited. Eventually Ricky got up, heading toward the back exit to take a smoke. Michael followed. The alley behind the bar was empty, the only sound the low buzz of a flickering light overhead. Ricky leaned against the wall, exhaling a long drag, until he noticed Michael standing there. His eyes narrowed. "The hell do you want?" Michael didn't say a word. He just took a step forward. Ricky chuckled, shaking his head. "Look, man, I don't know what." Michael moved fast. One hand slammed Ricky against the wall. The other pressed a knife just under his chin. Not deep enough to cut, but close enough to make a point. Ricky's breath hitched. "You and your friends," Michael said, voice low, steady. "Think this is funny? Think my wife's just some game for you?" Ricky swallowed hard. Look, man, it wasn't personal." Michael pressed the blade closer. "Ricky, shut up. You're going to tell me where the rest of them are." Ricky's eyes darted, looking for an escape, but there wasn't one. You don't want to do this," he stammered. Michael leaned in. "I didn't, but you made sure I had to." A pause, then Ricky broke. "They're at Austin's place," he rushed out, "by the old mill down Route 9. Just let me go, man." Michael stared at him for a long second, then he pulled back. "Run," he said. Ricky didn't need to be told twice. Austin's house was exactly where Ricky said it was, a rundown place sitting on acres of empty land, no neighbors, no one to hear anything. Michael parked down the road and made his way in on foot, keeping low. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. This had to end tonight. Through the window, he saw them, Austin and two others, sitting around drinking, laughing like they had no care in the world, like they hadn't spent the past few weeks terrorizing his wife. Michael gripped the wrench in his hand. He wasn't going to kill them, but he was going to make sure they never forgot his name, and after tonight, they'd never forget Adrian's either. Michael had always believed that when a man's pushed far enough, he finds out who he really is. Standing outside Austin's house, gripping a wrench like a weapon, he knew exactly who he was now, and so did they. He moved quickly. The back door wasn't locked. Stupid mistake. Michael slipped in without a sound, staying low, letting his eyes adjust to the dim glow of the living room lights. Austin was in the center of the room, feet propped up on the coffee table, laughing at something one of his friends had said. A half-empty beer dangled from his hand. Michael took another step forward. The floor creaked. Austin turned, blinking, trying to process what he was seeing. What the hell? Michael didn't give him time to react. The wrench connected with his knee first, a sickening crunch followed by a scream as Austin collapsed to the floor. His beer went flying, shattering on impact. The other two scrambled, knocking over chairs. One of them, Jason, reached for something in his waistband. Michael kicked the coffee table forward, slamming it into his ribs. Jason crashed back with a grunt, the gun skidding across the floor. The third guy, a wiry kid barely out of his teens, froze, hands up. Michael ignored him. Austin writhed on the floor, clutching his knee, his breath ragged. Michael crouched beside him, voice eerily calm. "I warned you," he said. "Told you to leave my wife alone." Austin spat at the ground, face contorted in pain. You think this is over?" Michael grabbed his collar, yanking him forward. "You come near her again, I promise you this will be the least of your problems." Austin tried to laugh, but it came out as a choked cough. "You're dead, man. You don't know who you're messing with." Michael pressed a knee into his broken leg. Austin screamed. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," Michael said. "A coward, a punk who hides behind his daddy's money." He glanced at the other two. "And your little crew? They aren't going to back you up. They're just as scared of you as they are of me." Silence. Jason was still gasping for air on the floor. The younger guy who hadn't moved looked at Austin, then at Michael, then at the door. Then he ran. Michael let him go. Jason didn't move, his eyes flicking between Michael and Austin. He wasn't going to fight. He was smart enough to know that much. But Austin, he still didn't get it. "You think this changes anything?" He hissed through clenched teeth. "I own this town. You're a dead man walking." Michael just smiled. Then he stood up, grabbed the gun from the floor, and emptied the clip into the wall. Austin flinched hard at the sound. Michael tossed the gun onto his chest. "Go ahead, call the cops. Tell them what happened." Austin's face paled. They both knew he wouldn't, because if he did, he'd have to explain why Michael had done this, why he'd had to. Michael turned and walked out. No one tried to stop him, and from that night on, no one ever messed with Adrian again. Michael didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands. His knuckles were swollen, split in places where bone had met flesh. The wrench sat in the sink, washed clean but not forgotten. He thought he'd feel something, relief, satisfaction, maybe even regret. But there was nothing, just silence. Adrian walked in around sunrise, wrapped in her robe, eyes still heavy with sleep. She stopped when she saw him. "You're hurt," she said softly. Michael exhaled, flexing his fingers. "It's nothing." She didn't move closer, just watched him like she was seeing someone new. "What did you do?" she finally asked. Michael met her gaze. He didn't lie. "I made sure they'll never come near you again." A long pause, then Adrian sat down across from him. "Is it over?" He thought about that, about the way Austin had looked at him, the way fear had finally settled into those smug eyes. "They won't bother you anymore," Michael said. Adrian nodded, but something about the way she studied him made his stomach twist. "You changed tonight," she murmured. He swallowed hard. "I did what I had to." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. "I know, I just don't want to lose you too." Michael didn't know how to answer that, because he had already lost something. The man he used to be, the one who believed in reason, in justice, in waiting for the system to do its job, was gone. and in his place stood someone else, someone who had crossed a line he could never step back from. Words spread fast. By noon, the whole town had heard about what had happened at Austin's place. No one said Michael's name, but they all knew. The sheriff didn't come knocking. No reports were filed. Austin and his friends kept their mouths shut, and just like that, the threat stopped. Adrian walked through town again without fear. No more stares, no more whispers. Michael should have felt proud, but instead, all he felt was tired. Because even though they had won, he wasn't sure who he had become in the process. And some nights when he looked at Adrian sleeping peacefully beside him, he wondered if she saw it too, if she saw the man who had fought for her, or the man who had learned to love the fight itself. Some battles you don't walk away from unchanged. Some victories cost more than you expect. Michael had protected his wife. He had made sure justice, or at least something close to it, was served. But deep down, he knew the truth. No one wins when they have to become the monster to fight one. What would you have done? Subscribe for more stories that make you think.